try this one for a minute. Top 3 books you'd recommend for self-improvement. I have really interesting views on what is self-improvement and what is not self-improvement. I actually really like some fictional books for self-improvement. One that I like a lot is that doesn't get recommended. So a lot of people recommend the same stuff for self-improvement, like Power of Now gets recommended a lot in RSD, or there are a lot of like Tony Robbins books that get recommended, stuff like that. But the one that I would throw out that's a fictional book that nobody probably has read is there's a book called The Hustler by Walter Tevis. It's actually about a pool player who is extremely, extremely talented in terms of the technical game of pool, but it's kind of hard to explain without going through the whole book, but he's essentially a loser, meaning in the definition of the book that he, in a tight situation, he finds a way to take the pressure off himself. He finds a way to lose because it's emotionally easier than winning. And so it's basically the entire book is about his journey to learning how to win. So he is very talented at the technical elements of the game, but you could say like the intangible character elements of his game he hasn't learned. Throughout the book he has the journey of learning them. I think it's just an amazing book, one of the best ones I've ever read. In terms of other self-help books, a lot of people recommend 6 Pillars of Self-Esteem by Nathaniel Branden, which I think is good. I actually have read only part of it, and the reason I've read only part of it is that as I was reading it, I felt I learned the exact same things from it as I learned from reading 2 novels by Ayn Rand, which are Atlas Shrugged and The Fountainhead. And this makes sense because Nathaniel Branden and Ayn Rand, I believe it was those two, had some kind of relationship or knew each other well and exchanged a lot of ideas. So there's a lot of crossover, I believe, between the two. I may have gotten the association wrong, but there's a connection between the 2 sets of books. And so you could read 6 Pillars of Self-Esteem. It'll be a quicker read to get to it, but for me, I find that it's emotionally compelling to have a story behind it, and in order to learn anything, this is an interesting sort of an aside when you're looking at learning or you're looking at teaching, that kind of thing. The technical elements of what you're teaching are important. Like, good information is important, but the other thing that really, really matters that is never emphasized and should be is buy-in. If you are bored while you're learning something, you won't buy into it. If you see the person teaching you as not a role model or not someone who you'd like to emulate, you won't buy in the same way. You won't learn as well. If you view that what you're learning is not practical, you probably won't buy into it and you will not learn it as well. A good example of this for me personally, I didn't do so well with like advanced calculus in college. I was an engineer. I did fine. I got okay grades, etc. But I wasn't really. I'd learned game. I wasn't really motivated to do it, etc. And so I didn't really care that much. And I was just trying to kind of get through it. And so I did mediocre. Interestingly enough, there was a time later on when I was kind of between career options. I didn't know what I was doing, and I did some tutoring work for a little bit because I've always been academically really, really good, and it paid relatively well on an hourly basis. So I was doing this, and I had this opportunity to make a lot of money tutoring this kid in calculus. It was I think it was second year calculus, so integral calculus. And I kind of knew it from a long time ago, but it was 8 or 10 years ago since I'd learned it. I wasn't very good at it. But I had to basically teach myself integral calculus in a matter of 2 or 3 days in order to teach this kid. And because I had a direct payoff for it, I viewed it as practical, and I was actually sort of actually intrigued by it for its own sake, as opposed to just trying to push through and pass a class. I was able to learn it really, really well, and I was able to tutor the kid from an F to an A- within a week. So I was bought in, right? I wasn't smarter 8 years on. I certainly wasn't more ready, it'd been a long time since I'd done any advanced math. I wasn't more primed for it or anything like that, but I just bought into it more and it made it very easy for me to learn. So don't underestimate buy-in, and that's why I actually like fictional books to teach you, because you associate with the character, you buy into the story, and it becomes emotionally relevant for you, whereas when you read a didactic textbook that's just do this, then do this, then do this, you get the information quickly, but a lot of times you don't buy into it. Another thing happens a lot when you learn game without being in the field. For example, a lot of guys will come to a hot seat, and if they don't go out afterwards and don't practice, they learned all the lessons, they kind of intellectually know them, but they don't know them on an emotional basis, and they don't understand the value of them. They're not deeply connected to the lessons. And so in a way they're lucky to have gotten those lessons so easily. In a way they're very unlucky because the lessons don't mean as much to them and they don't like hit them on that visceral emotional level. So that's very, very important. So for that reason, I would actually recommend like the Ayn Rand books over the Nathaniel Branden book, even though it's a much, much longer read, because it will really cement that for you. The other one I really like is, I'll tell you two more self-improvement books. One for learning conversational skills is Making People Talk by Barry Farber. It's out of print, but I think it's really, really good for someone who's introverted or someone who's like highly practical. My reason for not talking a lot early on in life wasn't that I was an introvert or that I didn't like people or that like I was shy or anything like that. It's that I'm very goal-oriented, and talking is not a very goal-oriented pursuit most of the time, right? Unless you're negotiating something or you're trying to make a deal with someone or there's actually like, you're exchanging value for value, like just doing small talk or just shooting the shit. There's not a lot of like perceived value in that interaction, and so I would just avoid those interactions. I viewed them as a waste of time. But that book allowed me to view them in the proper light and understand the purposes that conversation really serves, and how it is really valuable and useful, and it's not a waste of time. And then it also told me a lot of just general principles for starting and carrying conversation, and more importantly, maybe general attitudes for being a good conversationalist and deciding to be a conversationalist. So it got me buy-in and technique, so I was really, really good there. And then the last one I would recommend is The Art of Learning by Joshua Waitzkin. It's along the lines a bit of a Power of Now type of book, in that like there's a lot of emphasis on focus and a lot of emphasis on like the emotional side of things before the technical, and accepting failures and not getting too attached to that kind of stuff, which I think is really, really good. But I found it less woo, and I also related to it very well because I was a chess player growing up, and he was a chess player as well. So for anyone who's a little bit competitive and finds some of like the Eastern philosophy stuff a little like woo and like what the fuck, it's a good sort of indoctrination into a little bit of the how being a little bit more in the moment and even a little bit more like spiritual, dare I say, can actually be practical and actually get you results as a very goal-driven person. So it's a nice bridge for that. And again, that kind of area is not something I would have done much myself. So those are books I would really recommend. Especially, I know a lot of my fans, so to speak, come from technical backgrounds. A lot of guys are like engineers or like internet marketers or poker players. Careers where there's a lot of like intellectual activity, and coming from a logical background, having trouble with like the emotional sides of things. Those are really good shouts in terms of all that kind of stuff.